Welcome back, kids. Are you ready to hear chapter 19? Joan Gets a Shock. The Naughtiest Girl in the School, chapter 19. Joan had a wonderful birthday. She laughed and chattered in a way that no one had ever seen before. The little girl became quite pretty with happiness, and when she cut her birthday cake and gave a piece to everyone in the school, her face was a picture. Nobody could possibly look happier, though eating the Elizabeth eating the delicious cake. Goodness, that baker certainly did make Joan's cake well. It's gorgeous. That evening after supper, Elizabeth asked Joan to come and help her plant the lettuce seeds she had bought, but Joan shook her head. I can't, she said. I'd love to, Elizabeth, but I've got something important to do. What is it? Asked Elizabeth, rattling the seeds in her packets. Well, I've got to and thank my mother and father for their cards and the lovely cake and the book, said Joan. I must do that tonight. Oh, said Elizabeth in dismay. She turned away, biting her lip and frowning. Good gracious, she thought. I didn't think of Joan writing to say thank you. Whatever will her mother think when she gets Joan's letter thanking her for things she hasn't sent? Will she write and tell Joan she doesn't know anything about them? And what will poor Joan do then? Elizabeth went out to the garden, thinking hard. Now she had made a muddle. Why hadn't she thought of Joan writing to her mother? It was silly of her. Joan was going to be very unhappy and perhaps angry when she found out the truth. Perhaps it wasn't such a good idea after all, said Elizabeth to herself. Bother. Why do I do things without thinking first? I wonder if Joan's mother will be angry with me for pretending those cards and book and the cake were from Joan's parents. I don't feel happy about it anymore. I feel dreadful. She went to give John Terry the seeds. He was delighted. Good, he said, just what I wanted. I plant a new row of lettuce every week, Elizabeth, and then we have new lettuces growing in different sizes so that each week I have a fresh row to pull. Did you like the lettuces we had for tea yesterday? Those were out of the frames. I was rather proud of them. They were simply lovely, John, said Elizabeth, still busy thinking about Joan. She simply couldn't imagine what would happen, and she felt worried. She helped to plant the lettuce seeds, but John scolded her because she sowed them so thickly. I thought you knew something about gardening, he said. Do you want the lettuces to come up like a forest? Sorry, John, said Elizabeth. I was thinking about something else. You haven't been naughty, I hope, asked John, who liked Elizabeth and was always pleased when she came to help him in his garden. I hope you won't get ticked off at the meeting again. You've had enough of that. I'm afraid I shall be, said Elizabeth, sighing. She was worried about that, too. She was sure Nora would report her for spending a whole £10, and whatever would she say about it? She wasn't going to give her secret away and let everyone know that it was she and not Joan's parents who had sent the cake and the book. Things were suddenly getting very difficult. Joan was very happy for 2 days, and then she got a letter from her mother that took away all her happiness. Elizabeth was with Joan when she found the letter at tea time in the letter rack. Oh, Mother has written very quickly to answer my letter, said Joan happily, and she took the letter down. She tore it open and stood reading it. Then she turned very pale and looked with wide, miserable eyes at Elizabeth. Mother says, she didn't send me a card. She forgot, said Joan in a trembling voice, and she says she didn't send me a cake or that book, and she can't understand why I'm writing to thank her. Oh, Elizabeth. Elizabeth didn't know what to do or say. She put her arm round Joan and took her to the playroom. No one was there, for everyone had gone in to have tea. Joan sat down, still very white, and stared at Elizabeth. I don't understand it, said poor Joan. Oh, Elizabeth, I was so very happy, and now I feel dreadful. Who could have sent those things if it wasn't my mother? Still, Elizabeth couldn't say a word. How could she say she had done it? Her kindness now seemed like a cruel trick. Poor Joan. Come in and have some tea, said Elizabeth at last, finding her voice. You look so pale, Joan. Come and have some tea. It will do you good. But Joan shook her head. I'm not hungry. I couldn't eat anything, she said. Let me alone. You go in to tea without me. I want to be alone. Please, Elizabeth. You are kind and sweet to me, but I don't want anybody just now. I'm going out for a walk. I'll be better when I come back. Joan slipped out of the playroom. Elizabeth stared after her, unhappy and worried. Joan had gone out alone without anybody, which wasn't allowed. Elizabeth simply didn't know what to do. She went into tea very late and was scolded by Nora. "You're late, Elizabeth," snapped Nora. "You'll have to go without cake today." Elizabeth slipped into her place and said nothing. As she ate her tea, she noticed that the room was getting very dark indeed. "There's a good old storm blowing up," said Harry. "My goodness, look at that rain." "Splendid," said John. "I badly need it for my broad beans and peas." But Elizabeth did not think it was splendid. She was thinking of poor Joan out for a walk all alone in the storm. A roll of thunder sounded, and lightning flashed across the window. "Joan hadn't even got a hat on," said Elizabeth to herself. "She'll be soaked. If only I knew which way she'd gone, I'd go out and meet her with a mackintosh. Oh dear, everything's going wrong. She could hardly eat any tea. When the meal was over, she ran to the playroom and then to the bedroom to see if Joan was back. She wasn't. Elizabeth looked out of the windows. She felt very ashamed and guilty. "I meant to be so kind, and all I've done is to give Joan a dreadful shock, make her very unhappy, and now she's out in this dreadful thunderstorm," thought Elizabeth. For a whole hour Elizabeth watched for Joan to come back. The thunder gradually rolled itself away and the lightning stopped, but the heavy rain went on, lashing down on the new leaves of the trees and making a noise like the waves breaking at sea. At last Joan came back. Elizabeth saw a small dripping figure coming in through the garden door. She rushed to Joan at once. "Joan, you're simply soaked through. Come and change at once." Water dripped off Joan's dress, for the rain had been tremendous. The little girl was soaked through to the skin. She was shivering with cold. "Oh, poor Joan," said Elizabeth, dragging her friend upstairs. "You'll catch a dreadful cold. Come on, you must change into dry things straight away." On the way up, the two girls met the matron of the school, who looked after them when they were ill, and who bandaged their arms and legs when they hurt themselves. She was a fat, jolly woman, and everyone liked her, though she could be very strict when she liked. She stopped when she saw Joan. "Good gracious," she said, "whatever have you been to get into that state, you silly child?" "She's been out in the rain," said Elizabeth. "She's awfully cold, matron. She's going to put on dry things." "I've got some of Joan's things airing in my hot cupboard," said the matron. "She'd better come along with me. Gracious child, what a sight you look." Joan went with matron. She was hurriedly stripped of her soaking clothes, and matron rubbed her down well with a rough towel. Joan said nothing at all, but stood looking so sad and miserable that matron was worried. "I think I'd better take your temperature," she said. "You don't look right to me. Put this warm dressing gown round you for a minute. I'll get the thermometer." She sent Elizabeth away. The little girl went off to the music room to practice, feeling very upset. She practiced her scale steadily, and somehow it comforted her. She went to look for Joan at supper time, but she was nowhere to be seen. "Haven't you heard?" said Belinda. "Joan's ill. She got a high temperature. She's in bed in the sand." The sand, or the sanatorium, was where any boy or girl was put when they were ill. It was a cheerful, sunny room built apart from the school, so Joan was there ill. Elizabeth's heart sank. She felt that it was all her fault. "Cheer up. She'll be all right tomorrow, I expect," said Belinda, seeing Elizabeth's dismayed face. But Joan wasn't all right. She was worse. The doctor came and went with a grave face. It was dreadful. "I know what would make Joan better," thought Elizabeth in despair. "If only her mother could come and see her and love her a bit, Joan would be quite all right. Her chill would go and she'd be happy again." Elizabeth sat and wondered what she could do. Then an idea came into her head. She would write to Joan's mother. She would tell her of the presents she'd given to Joan, pretending that they were from Joan's mother. She would tell her how much Joan loved her mother and wanted her to think of her and remember her. And she would beg her to come and see Joan because she was ill. Elizabeth jumped up. She ran to Joan's writing paper, which she kept in a shelf in the playroom. In it she found the letter from Joan's mother, and Elizabeth copied the address for herself. Then she slipped the letter back. "Now I'll write to Miss Townsend," said the little girl. "It will be the most difficult letter I've ever written, but it has got to be done. Oh dear, what an awful lot of trouble I'm going to get into. And now you will have to wait until tomorrow to see what trouble Elizabeth got into.